Imagine lying flat on your back on like a solid wood floor. You're completely still. But inside your head, your brain is just screaming in absolute panic that you are plummeting into this bottomless abyss.
Well, that sounds absolutely terrifying.
Right. You just feel like you are perpetually falling. And for a woman named Cheryl Schultz, that wasn't just some hypothetical nightmare. That was her everyday reality.
Yeah, and the wildest part is that according to the medical establishment at the time, her condition was considered entirely permanent.
Hopeless, basically.
Exactly, which, I mean, it actually makes total sense if you look at how science viewed the mind back then.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are digging into some truly mind-bending notes and excerpts from Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself.
It's such a foundational text.
It really is. And our core mission today is to completely dismantle a 400-year-old myth. Because for centuries, I mean, the smartest people on the planet thought of the human brain as this machine, like a glorious, complex machine, but still a machine with fixed parts.
Right, like a clock. If you break a gear, it just stays broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They believed our neural circuits were completely hardwired, and that once you reached adulthood, your brain was just locked into this long, slow process of physical decline.
Yeah, it was a worldview that scientists actually referred to as neurological nihilism.
Which is such a dark term.
It is, but the assumption was literally just that if you were born with a cognitive deficit or, if you suffered brain damage, you were simply damaged goods. There was no fixing the hardware.
But today, obviously, we know about the revolutionary science of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to literally change its own physical structure and its function based on your thoughts and your activities.
And for you listening right now, this matters immensely.
Oh, totally. Whether you are trying to learn a new language or break a really stubborn bad habit or just, keep your mind sharp as you age, understanding how your brain actually rewires itself is basically the ultimate shortcut to cognitive fitness.
But before we get into how you can actually harness that, we have to establish a really crucial framing concept here, and that is the plastic paradox.
The classic paradox, right?
Yeah, because neuroplasticity makes our brains incredibly resourceful. I mean, capable of these astonishing feats of recovery and learning, but it's a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, that exact same plasticity makes us deeply vulnerable. The exact same biological mechanism that allows you to master, say, a genius-level skill, is the exact same mechanism that locks in your most destructive, stubborn, bad habits.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to prove just how malleable the brain really is, I think we have to start with the senses. The fundamental hardware we rely on to navigate the physical world.
Right, going back to Cheryl Schultz.
Yeah, the woman who felt like she was always falling. So the sources explained that she had received this routine antibiotic called gentamicin.
Which is highly effective for certain infections, but in rare cases, it carries a really severe toxicity risk for the inner ear.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it literally wiped out the microscopic hair cells inside Cheryl's vestibular system. And those hairs, they basically act like tiny biological levels. They translate gravity and head movement into electrical signals.
So without them, her brain was essentially flying blind.
Completely blind.
So traditional doctors told her it was hopeless, the balance center hardware is broken, go home. But then there's this bizarre invention in the notes from a pioneer named Bach-y-Rita.
He was such a maverick. He didn't buy into that machine metaphor at all.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
He created a device that honestly sounds like science fiction. It involved a standard construction hard hat, and it had an accelerometer inside it to measure movement. And that hat was wired to a computer, which was then connected to this thin plastic strip that had 144 electrodes on it. And Cheryl was instructed to just put that strip on her tongue.
It sounds absurd, but the underlying logic was actually brilliant. As Cheryl tilted her head, the accelerometer in the hat detected the movement, right? And it translated that into electrical shocks sent to specific electrodes on her tongue.
Wait, shocks?
Well, it felt like champagne bubbles, according to the notes. So if she leans forward, the bubbles tingle at the front of her tongue. If she leans back, they move to the back.
Wait, so you're telling me the brain is left like a fixed set of cables and more like, I don't know, a universal decoder ring?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't actually care how the data gets in as long as it receives those electrical signals.
That is exactly it. The brain speaks one universal language, and that's electrical impulses. It doesn't physically see light or hear sound. It just processes the electrical patterns sent by the eyes or the ears.
That is what?
Right. And in Cheryl's case, her brain realized the tongue was suddenly sending spatial data. It figured out how to reroute those tactile signals, completely bypass the normal sensory cortex, and send them straight into the balance center of her brain.
And within minutes of wearing this device, she could stand normally.
It's incredible.
But here is the most shocking part of Cheryl's story. When she took the hat off, the balance remained.
Yes, the residual effect.
Yeah. At first, it was just this residual effect of about 20 seconds. But as she kept training with the hat day after day, the effect lasted for hours. And eventually, after months, she didn't need the device at all.
She was functionally cured.
Her brain had somehow unmasked and strengthened these secondary, previously dormant neural pathways to achieve balance without her inner ear.
And Bach-y-Rita knew this wasn't just some sensory fluke because he had actually seen it happen with his own father, Pedro.
Oh, right, the stroke recovery story.
Yeah. Pedro suffered a massive stroke that paralyzed his body and his face. Traditional rehab just wrote him off. But Bach-y-Rita's brother essentially forced Pedro to crawl against a wall like a baby. He turned these agonizing daily chores into relentless physical exercises.
And he recovered.
Fully recovered. He actually went back to teaching college. And years later, an autopsy revealed that 97% of the nerves from his cerebral cortex to his spine had been entirely destroyed by that stroke.
97%. That's insane. So, okay, if the brain can reroute balance through a tongue and physically reorganize itself to overcome a 97% destroyed neural pathway after a stroke, what happens if the brain's foundational logic centers, like the underlying software, are fundamentally broken right from birth?
Well, the approach changes there from physical rehabilitation to cognitive targeting.
Okay, because I was absolutely fascinated by the notes on Barbara Arrowsmith-Young. She was born with these severe asymmetrical learning disabilities.
Right, she had a brilliant memory, but her spatial and logic processing areas were essentially dark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She couldn't tell her left from her right. She couldn't read a clock. She couldn't understand cause and effect. At one point, she actually accidentally put sulfuric acid up her nose because she physically could not process the grammar on the warning label.
She was living in this perpetual fog, but she found a way out, and it was through two distinct pieces of scientific research.
Okay, what were they?
First, there were Mark Rosenzweig's experiments with rats. He proved that rats raised in these enriched, highly stimulating environments physically grew heavier, thicker brains. The neurons actually sprouted new dendrite branches compared to the rats that were just kept in boring cages.
Okay, so stimulation equals physical growth.
Right. And the second piece of the puzzle was Alexander Luria's work. Luria was a Russian neuropsychologist who studied a soldier named Comrade Zazetsky. And Zazetsky had taken a bullet to the left hemisphere of his brain.
And his symptoms matched Barbara's perfectly. Because of that specific bullet wound, he lost the ability to relate symbols, logic, and grammar, which gave Barbara this massive realization. Her deficits weren't just some vague intellectual slowness. They had a specific physical address in her brain.
Exactly. Because if her deficit was physical, and Rosenzweig's rats could grow heavier brains through targeted stimulation, she hypothesized that she could isolate and exercise her weak brain areas like a muscle.
Which completely defied the standard model.
Oh, totally. Traditional special education relies heavily on compensations, working around the weakness. If a child can't read, you give them an audiobook. But Barbara rejected that entirely.
She created these grueling cognitive exercises instead. Since she couldn't understand the relationship between clock hands, she made hundreds of flashcards of complex clock faces. And she forced herself to read them over and over until it literally hurt.
It's like lifting weights for your brain.
Yeah. And when she got faster, she added hands for seconds, then fractions of a second. Eventually, she mastered 10-handed clocks in seconds. And by doing this, she completely cured her logic deficits. She literally built herself a better brain, and that led her to found the Arrowsmith School.
What's really fascinating here is that postmortem exams of stimulated brains confirm this muscle analogy. The brain physically thickens.
Yeah.
At Barbara's school, they take kids with severe dyslexic and motor issues, kids with messy handwriting or stuttering reading, and they put an eye patch over their left eye.
Why the left eye?
Because of the way our nervous system is wired contralaterally, patching the left eye forces the visual input to travel to the right side of the brain. And then they have these kids relentlessly trace complex lines and squiggles.
Which on the surface sounds completely unrelated to reading.
It does sound weird, but they are deliberately forcing the premotor cortex, which is the area responsible for stringing together complex sequences of movement, to fire repeatedly. They're strengthening the underlying hardware that makes reading possible in the first place.
I want to push back on something here, though. If strengthening the hardware is the real answer, does that mean traditional schooling, which teaches kids to work around their weaknesses, might actually be doing them a massive disservice? Like, are we just letting that crucial brain real estate waste away?
In many cases, yes, it is a missed opportunity. By relying solely on workarounds, you are basically starving the weak brain area of the targeted stimulation it desperately needs to grow. Patching the software is a short-term fix. Early, highly targeted exercises could potentially fix the root hardware problem.
So if the brain is like a muscle that grows and shrinks based on stimulation, how does it know which specific muscles to build and which to let atrophy? To understand that, we really have to look at the microscopic maps inside our heads.
Right. We have to look at Michael Merzenich. He is an absolute titan in this field. He proved adult plasticity by mapping the brains of monkeys neuron by neuron using microelectrodes.
Okay.
And he demonstrated the cellular mechanism behind what is basically the golden rule of neuroplasticity, which is neurons that fire together, wire together.
There is a wild experiment in the sources where Merzenich literally sews two of a monkey's fingers together to prove this, right?
Yes, he did. And the underlying logic is that our brain maps are incredibly economical. When he sewed the fingers together, they moved simultaneously. This meant that the sensory signals from both fingers arrived at the brain at the exact same millisecond.
So the brain gets confused.
Not confused, it just adapts. The brain's mapping system basically says, well, if these signals always arrive together, they must be part of the same physical structure. So it physically fused the two separate neural maps for those fingers into one single combined map.
Wow.
And later, when he surgically grafted skin from one finger to another, the brain map migrated right alongside the physical skin.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Because this concept of competitive brain real estate explains so much about human behavior. This is exactly why breaking a bad habit is so incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely.
It is not just a lack of willpower. That bad habit has literally colonized physical real estate in your brain. To break it, you have to actively starve it of use so a new, healthier habit can invade and conquer that map space.
And Merzenich actually applied this exact concept of competitive mapping to treat severe language and reading disorders. Dyslexic children often suffer from muddy auditory processing.
Muddy in what way?
Their auditory neurons fire too slowly to distinguish fast consonant sounds, like the difference between ba and da. So his team created a computer program called ForWord, and it artificially slowed down these sounds, forcing the brain to clearly map the distinction.
And it was structured like a video game, right? When the kids identified the sounds correctly, they were rewarded with these funny animations.
Yes, and that reward component is absolutely vital. The animations trigger the release of dopamine and acetylcholine, and these neurochemicals act like biological fixatives. They essentially lock in the learning.
That makes sense.
In just 6 weeks of using this program, kids were jumping almost 2 years in their language development. But the researchers noticed an unexpected spillover effect. It was also dramatically helping children with autism.
Which is incredible. The sources mention autistic children who suddenly started making better eye contact, greeting people, and even understanding humor just from a language game.
Right, so Merzenich investigated this and discovered a link between autism and the brain's critical period of development. During infancy, our brain maps are incredibly plastic, they absorb the environment effortlessly, and a chemical called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, acts like a biological glue to consolidate these new connections.
Okay, so BDNF is the glue.
Exactly. Merzenich theorized that the continuous, unstructured white noise of our modern environments, like heaters and engines and fans, might be massively overstimulating the auditory cortex in genetically predisposed infants.
Wait, so because the auditory neurons are constantly firing at this background noise, they prematurely exhaust the brain supply of that BDNF glue.
Precisely. It slams the window of the critical period shut way too early, before the child's brain can create clear, differentiated maps, so everything ends up wired to everything else.
Oh, wow.
This explains why some autistic children have hypersensitive bionic hearing. The entire auditory brain map lights up at once, which is incredibly overwhelming.
Right.
By using targeted, slowed-down brain exercises, Merzenich was essentially reopening that critical period to help them untangle those maps.
Okay, so neurons that fire together wire together, and our brain maps are fiercely competitive. Does this concept of physical mapping apply to our deepest, most primal desires, like romantic attraction.
It absolutely does. The human libido is remarkably plastic compared to other animals. We don't just possess a simple biological drive to reproduce. We acquire highly specific tastes and types, often wired into our brains during early childhood critical periods.
I was reading the notes on patient A, and it's a pretty dark case study, but it illustrates this perfectly. He was a man who was exclusively attracted to women who were emotionally out of control, already attached to other men, and who encouraged him to be abusive.
Right, nice, stable women completely
Yes,
bored him.
Exactly. And it turned out his mother had been a severe alcoholic. She was abusive, seductive, and totally chaotic. So during his critical period, his developing brain had quite literally wired physical intimacy together with violence and chaos.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see this extreme neuroplastic rewiring happening today on a mass scale. And we should be clear, we're just looking at the mechanics of this objectively, but we see this with internet pornography.
Right, the sources don't take a moral stance, they just look at the neurology.
Exactly. Porn perfectly fulfills all the requirements for driving massive plastic change. You have intense focus, repetitive imagery, and massive, effortless hits of dopamine.
A perfect storm for the brain.
Yes. And the danger lies in two specific mechanisms: tolerance and sensitization. Tolerance means the brain simply adapts to the thrill. What used to excite the brain no longer does, which forces the user to seek out harder, more extreme novelty just to get the baseline dopamine hit.
The sources actually mention a writer named Sean Thomas who experienced exactly that. He started with softcore images, but his brain demanded more novelty, and he eventually escalated into bizarre fetishes and hardcore sadomasochism just to feel anything.
And that escalation is what leads to sensitization. This is where a specific protein called delta FOSB builds up in the brain.
Delta FOSB.
Right, think of delta FOSB like a molecular switch in your reward center. When you flood the brain with enough dopamine, this protein accumulates and physically flips that switch. It creates intense, overwhelming cravings for the stimulus. And the truly terrifying part of sensitization is that it creates craving even when the user doesn't actually like the porn anymore.
That is wild. They want it, but they don't like it.
Exactly. It's a purely mechanical drive.
And the most extreme example of how deeply opposing sensations can get wired together is Bob Flanagan. He was born with cystic fibrosis, and as a young child, he endured horrific, agonizing medical treatments just to keep him breathing. Needles, tubes, constant confinement.
It's just relentless trauma.
Relentless. And to cope with that inescapable agony, his developing brain plastically rewired itself. It literally wired his pain system directly into his sexual pleasure system. As an adult, he became a famous supermasochist who achieved sexual gratification by having his partner torture him. He even nailed his own body parts to a wooden board.
It really proves there's almost no limit to how the brain can rewire its associations. But the good news is, just as we can wire these destructive maps, we also possess a distinct chemical process for reversing them.
Which is unlearning.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the most powerful catalyst for unlearning is falling in love.
Is that because of the dopamine rush?
Sort of. Dopamine creates the initial state of globalization, where everything feels wonderful and, even a partner's flaws become charming. But physical intimacy and love trigger the massive release of a neuromodulator called oxytocin.
Right, the bonding hormone.
Exactly. And the researcher Walter J. Freeman argues that oxytocin acts as a chemical eraser. It literally melts down existing neural connections. It weakens the old selfish neural networks, or the networks tied to past heartbreak and destructive types.
Wait, so it's literally like shaking an Etch-a-Sketch. You actually have to wipe the old picture before your brain can plastically reorganize itself around a new partner or a new baby.
That is a perfect analogy, yes. You have to melt down the old maps to build new ones.
Which is just incredible. But this concept of unlearning a stuck neural state isn't just for emotional baggage, right? It actually applies to physical movement, too. It solved one of the most tragic medical mysteries of all time, which is why stroke victims remain paralyzed.
Right, because we know that a stroke causes physical brain tissue to die. But what puzzled scientists for decades was why patients frequently lost the use of limbs that weren't totally destroyed by the stroke.
Like Dr. Michael Bernstein. He was a 54-year-old eye surgeon who played tennis every day. He suffered a massive stroke that paralyzed his left side. And traditional rehab gave him a few weeks of physical therapy, and then just sent him home with a cane and a useless left hand.
Yeah.
He couldn't even turn the key to start his Porsche. Traditional medicine said his motor cortex was permanently damaged. Deal with it.
But a somewhat rogue scientist named Edward Taub challenged this. Taub actually started his career overturning a massive neuroscientific dogma called Sherrington's reflexological theory.
Okay, what was that?
Well, Sherrington believed all movement was just a spinal reflex reacting to an outside stimulus. Stimulus in, movement out. To prove him wrong, Taub performed a surgical procedure called deferentation on a monkey's arm.
Deferentation.
Right. He essentially cut all the sensory nerves, meaning the monkey couldn't feel the arm at all.
And, as expected, the monkey stopped using it entirely because it couldn't feel it.
Exactly. But Taub did something totally ingenious. He put the monkey's good arm in a sling, he physically constrained it. Suddenly, forced to survive without its primary arm, the monkey started using the numb, deferented arm perfectly.
Wow.
It proved it could move without any sensory reflexes at all.
Which led Taub to his genius insight, which is learned no news. After a stroke or a major injury, the brain goes into a state of cortical shock. The patient tries to move their arm, they fail, and they try again, and they fail. And very quickly, the brain essentially learns that the arm is useless.
Yes, and because of the use it or lose it principle of brain mapping, the real estate for that arm rapidly atrophies.
So the paralysis is partly due to physical damage, but it is largely a learned psychological habit.
It is a learned habit.
Think about how this applies to everyday life for you listening. Think about math anxiety, or telling yourself you're just not a creative person. If you fail at something once and stop trying, your brain experiences a micro version of learned non-use. You literally shrink the physical map for that skill.
That is precisely how it works. And to cure this learned habit of paralysis, Taub developed constraint-induced movement therapy, or CI therapy. Dr. Bernstein was one of his first human patients.
Right.
Taub constrained Bernstein's good right arm in a sling, forcing him to use his paralyzed left arm to do menial, frustrating, repetitive tasks for 8 hours a day. Cleaning windows, stacking cans, stretching rubber bands.
Non-stop, 8 hours a day.
Relentlessly. By forcing the brain to fire those specific motor neurons, Taub forced Bernstein's brain to rewire itself. It physically built new neural pathways around the dead stroke tissue. Bernstein actually regained his fine motor skills, he learned to write the alphabet with his paralyzed hand, and he returned to playing tennis.
That is so inspiring.
He woke up the paralyzed limb by simply refusing to let the brain accept the learned non-use.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. We started with the idea of the brain as a rigid, fixed machine, a clock with broken gears. But through Cheryl's rerouted balance, Barbara's targeted exercises, Merzenich's maps, the plasticity of our desires, and Taub's stroke patients, we've seen that the brain is not a machine at all.
Far from it.
It is a living, fiercely competitive ecosystem. And the takeaway for you is profound. Your daily habits, the media you consume, the thoughts you think, and the skills you practice, or avoid practicing, are actively physically reshaping the real estate in your head right this second.
Every single day.
To keep your brain young and agile, you cannot just coast on the skills you've already mastered. Think of the nucleus basalis as your brain's control center for attention. To keep it pumping out acetylcholine, which is the chemical of plasticity, you have to continually learn intensely novel, challenging things.
This does raise an important question, though, and I want to leave everyone with a final, slightly provocative thought to chew on.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've established today that our brains are constantly physically molding themselves to perfectly match the tools we use and the environments we inhabit. So look at our modern world. A world of fragmented attention, endless algorithmic scrolling, 15-second videos, and instant digital gratification.
Right.
If our brains ruthlessly wire themselves to our environment, how is this rapidly changing digital landscape physically rewiring the brain maps of the entire human race? Are we using our neuroplasticity to evolve our minds, or are we just building a more comfortable trap for ourselves?